The JFK 35 podcast is produced by the JFK Library Foundation and made possible with the help of a generous grant from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation. This episode of JFK 35 contains adult language that may not be appropriate for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the JFK Library Foundation staff, board, or donors, or the JFK Library. The material and information presented here is for general historical and educational information purposes only. The views expressed in the podcast are not meant to imply any endorsement of or opposition to any organization or political party.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America.
My name is Geraldine Ferraro. I proudly accept your nomination for Vice President of the United States.
Yes, the world is watching what we do. Yes, America's destiny is ours to choose. So let's be stronger together, my fellow Americans.
Let's fight for it. Let's get out there. Let's vote for it. And together, let us write the next great chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told.
For more than 150 years, women have put their name forward to run in a presidential election. Of those women, only 3 have made it onto the ticket for a major party, and just 2 of them have made it to the top of the ballot.
Vice President Kamala Harris made history in 2020 by becoming the first woman elected to be Vice President of the United States. And in just a few days, she has the chance to break what many have called the highest glass ceiling, being elected President of the United States. We'll talk about the significance of this historic moment next on our special election 2024 edition of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Jamie Richardson.
And I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to the latest season of JFK 35. This is the final episode of a special season where we have looked back at the historic nature of the 2024 election.
And at how today's campaigns connect to those from the 1960s. We hope you enjoyed listening to all 6 episodes featuring interviews with historians, journalists, and other experts to discuss presidential politics from the Kennedy era to today.
In 1872, almost 50 years before women would win the right to vote, Victoria Woodhull put her name in as candidate for president for the new Equal Rights Party. Woodhull would be the first woman to run for president, but not the last. It would be almost more than 90 years later when Maine Senator Margaret Chase Smith became the first woman to run for a major party nomination, the Republican Party. Just before deciding to enter the race, Smith spoke with CBS News correspondent Nancy Dickerson, the mother of CBS News anchor John Dickerson. She asked about the concept of a woman running for president in 1964.
Senator, would you call yourself a suffragette or a modern-day feminist?
Well, I call myself a person, Nancy. You know, I get a little out of patience with all these labels attached to people, and I think women are people.
What is the woman's place as you define it? I know you've thought about this.
Yes, I've talked about it a good deal. I think home is basic as far as women are concerned. I think most women want a home and a husband and family. But I really think that a woman should serve wherever she feels best qualified to serve, wherever she's most desirous to serve.
Now, Senator Smith, for all practical purposes, do you think a woman in the United States today actually be nominated on the ticket as president?
Well, it would be an uphill job, I'm sure, but I think it's very possible.
But is this country sophisticated enough to elect a woman?
Why not?
Barry Goldwater would ultimately win the nomination that year, although Smith would get 27% of the vote in the Illinois primary, enough for second place in that state. The question of whether voters would elect a woman candidate would continue throughout the decades. Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress in 1968, ran for president in 1972. She spoke about the issue of gender and race and electability.
I have faith in the American people. I believe that we are smart enough to correct our mistakes. I believe we are intelligent enough to recognize the talent, energy, and dedication which all Americans, including women and minorities, have to offer.
It would be 44 years after Shirley Chisholm, 52 years after Margaret Chase Smith, and 144 years after Victoria Woodhull when a woman would finally be nominated as a major party's candidate for president. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton would speak to the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia and discuss the moment nearly 150 years in the making.
Tonight, we've reached a milestone in our nation's march toward a more perfect union. The first time that a major party has nominated a woman for president. Standing here as my mother's daughter and my daughter's mother, I'm so happy this day has come. I'm happy for grandmothers and little girls and everyone in between. I'm happy for boys and men, because when any barrier falls in America, it clears the way for everyone. After all, when there are no ceilings, the sky's the limit. So let's keep going. Let's keep going until every one of the 161 million women and girls across America has the opportunity she deserves to have.
Clinton would fall just short of winning the presidency and breaking what she called the highest glass ceiling in American politics. Despite the loss, the momentum for women in politics did not stop. By 2022, there would be more women serving as governors and in Congress than ever before.
And in 2020, Kamala Harris would be elected the first woman vice president in the country's history. All of this leads to a historic matchup this year between Vice President Harris and former President Donald Trump, the same person who won the 2016 election against Secretary Clinton. I had the chance to discuss the historic nature of this year's election and what it means for women in politics with Laurie Nsiah-Jefferson, director of the Center for Women in Politics at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Laurie, thank you for joining me.
Sure. Glad to be here.
Laurie, we're here because we are again sort of at a crossroads. There is a very qualified, well-qualified female candidate in the race, Kamala Harris. And the question that's on a lot of the public's mind is, will she be the first woman to sort of break that glass ceiling that has been attempted before from other candidates? And there have been several women before Kamala Harris who made pioneering runs for the White House. Can you tell us about some of these historic women and their candidacies and why none of them were able to quite get across that finish line?
Oh, absolutely. The first woman who ran for presidential office was Victoria Woodhull. She announced her run on April 2nd, 1870, by sending a notice to the New York Herald. At the time, women were not allowed to vote. It would be another 50 years before ratification of the 19th Amendment assured the ballot to American women. I should note that when we say American women, we are speaking of white women. Furthermore, it's important to note, for context, the first presidential vote was in 1788. So I just wanted to start off with the first woman who ran for presidential office. And I'd be more than happy to speak about Margaret Chase Smith, Shirley Chisholm, Geraldine Ferraro, and Hillary Clinton. Let's start with Margaret Chase Smith. And I'd just like to give you a little bit of background about her, because it's important to kind of paint a picture of who these women were before they ran for office. So Margaret Smith was born in Skowhegan, Maine on December 14th, 1897, and she graduated from the town's high school and was a primary school teacher for 2 years. And what's notable about her was she was the first woman to serve in both houses of Congress. In 1940, she was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives to fill the vacancy caused by her husband's death. She successfully fought off 4 male rivals for the primary nomination to keep her seat and went on to serve 4 terms in the House of Representatives. So that in itself is groundbreaking. And she was easily elected in 1948 in her first term in the U.S. Senate, making her the only woman, and I stress again, the only woman in the Senate at the time. And she was elected 3 more times in the Senate. And in July 1964, at the Republican National Convention, Smith became the first woman to have her name placed onto a nomination of a major party. Vermont Senator George Aiken at the Republican National Convention nominated her. And she received Republican primary votes in New Hampshire, Illinois, Massachusetts, Texas, and Oregon, among others. But interestingly enough, she removed herself from contention after the first ballot. While running, she stated she would not miss any time in the Senate. Now, that's unusual, nor would she accept any donation. So again, she was an interesting woman who had her own standards. Her campaign was staffed by volunteers, and she did not run any TV or radio ads. Nevertheless, Smith went on to win nearly 30% of the vote in Illinois, a state she actively campaigned in, and votes in, again, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Texas, where she had no campaign appearances at all. So that was pretty remarkable. In total, she received the votes of 26 delegates. And again, her presidency was really more symbolic than tactical. In running for office, she asserted she wanted the role to break the barrier against women being taken as serious candidates for the presidency. This, again, was a very important action. In the end, unfortunately, Barry Goldwater won the Republican nomination in 1964, then lost the presidency to Democratic candidate Lyndon B. Johnson. And Smith, after that, continued to serve in the Senate until she lost in the 1972 election. So again, a very notable, impressive woman.
Right. And amazing how much she did with no political advertising and not accepting donations. Almost unheard of when we think about candidates today.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And she really seemed to be very committed to running her race the way she wanted to run the race. Again, something that is probably not as common now. She ran on her own standards, and she decided what was important.
And so I think the next person on our list in chronological order, if I'm right, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be Shirley Chisholm's decision to run.
Yeah, and Shirley Chisholm is one of my most, I would say, my favorite past candidate. She was born in Brooklyn, New York on November 30th, 1924. She graduated from Brooklyn College and earned a master's degree at Columbia. Again, and in 1924, she was born actually the same year my dad was born. I think she would have been 100 years old by now. She served in the U.S. Congress from 1969 to 1983, and she was the first African-American woman to serve in Congress, a huge, huge feat. Prior to her service in Congress, she served in the New York State Legislature from 1964 to 1968. She was also a school teacher and director of child care centers before going into public office. But this is what I really want to say about Shirley Chisholm, what makes me really excited about her. And if anybody hasn't, they should watch the documentary of her political career called Unbought and Unbossed. So what I like to say is before Carol Moseley Braun, before Barack Obama, before Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, Shirley Chisholm was both the first woman, the first African-American woman to run for the nomination of a major U.S. party. Again, as I mentioned, one of her campaign posters said, "Bring U.S., which is us, together. Vote Chisholm in 1972. And then underneath on the poster, it says, "Unbought and Unbossed." Think about a woman saying "unbought and unbossed" in 1972, and a Black woman at that, a very strong message. And one of the things I love about what she said in her campaign was, "I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement, although I'm equally proud." So again, she was very, very clear and very proud of who she was, but she was saying, I am running as a person, but I am recognizing the needs of women and people of color in the general populate. The Congresswoman tried to win the White House by consolidating the Black and women's vote, but unfortunately it didn't work in 1972. As you can imagine, the country was beset with both racist and sexist opposition at the time. She failed to win her party's nomination, losing to anti-Vietnam War candidate Senator John McGovern. Her other opponents were all white men, including Hubert Humphrey, Edward Muskie, Henry M. Jackson, and notably George Wallace. She campaigned throughout the country and was on the ballot in 12 primaries in what was largely an educational campaign. She received 151 votes at the Democratic National Convention, and she was always an advocate for the poor and inner city residents. Chisholm said, "I am and always will be a catalyst for change," and would go on to serve for another 11 years in Congress. So again, one of my favorite candidates of all time, and she's still a role model to me in many ways if I ever run for office.
Shirley Chisholm was absolutely a role model for many, and probably looked at by some of the candidates we're about to talk with now, particularly maybe Kamala Harris today. But as you mentioned, both Chisholm and Smith did not get across the convention vote. Neither made it through the convention. But the next person I want to just talk briefly about is Geraldine Ferraro, who, while not running for president, she was the first woman to be put on a major party's ticket, surviving the convention and going into the general election as Walter Mondale's vice presidential running mate.
Yes. And, I think that's what's really very interesting about Geraldine Ferraro was not only just her run as a vice presidential candidate, but also the social context around the time in which she was running. And what we know is that 3 women have run as vice presidential candidates in the U.S. Democratic Geraldine Ferraro, as we just talked about, Republican Sarah Palin in 2008, and of course, Democratic Kamala Harris in 2020. And what I'd like to say is a little bit about the social and the political context at the time in which Geraldine Ferraro was going to run for office. Joanne Holes, then the executive director of the Women's Vote Project and a member of the small group of behind-the-scenes activists known as A-Team, worked to propel Ferraro into the history books. In 1984, national politics was even more an old boys network than it is today, as you can imagine. Just 24 of the 535 voting members of Congress and no governors were women in this country. By those standards, the notion of a female vice president was completely outrageous. And even Ferraro said with typical candor, any presidential candidate is going to choose a woman as a running mate. No presidential candidate is going to choose a woman as a running mate unless he's 15 points behind the polls. And when I first encountered that, it didn't make any sense to me. I said, why would a running mate who's 15 points behind in the polls choose a woman? Wouldn't that make things worse for him? That was my first thought. And as I began to study and look at this more, I began to understand the reason why. And so this is exactly what happened. In the Democratic attempt to unseat President Ronald Reagan, former Vice President Walter Mondale, he was lagging some 12 to 19 points at the time, and he selected Ferraro as his running mate. Now, we all know, unfortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it, the election ended poorly for the Democrats. Reagan and his Vice President George Bush won with all but one state voting for the incumbents. But why was Ferraro a thought? Again, I'm going to ask that question. Why was she seen? Why was a woman seen as important in the residency at this time? Well, there's a few answers to this. When in 1980, former Governor Ronald Reagan ascended to the presidency, the exit polls showed 2 unusual data points. 1, women voters turned out at a higher rate than men for the first time since they'd gotten the right to vote nationwide in 1920. And 2, a small but significant disparity had emerged between who men and women voted for, with 8% fewer women than men supporting Reagan. So the National Organization of Women and its president, Eleanor Sneal, looked at the exit poll data, and she was the one who dubbed that difference the gender gap. All this unfolded amid an outpouring of feminist activism and shifting attitudes about women in politics. So this was going on, again, at the time when the ERA did not pass. The feminists were not very happy about that. Roe versus Wade had recently been passed in the early 70s. 11 years prior to that, Shirley Chisholm had run for president. In addition to that, in 1977, tens of thousands of women had gathered at a conference to really think about women's issues in politics and policy. And also in 1983, Gallup poll found that 80% of Americans professed that they would vote for a qualified woman for president. And this was a marked improvement from this question when it was asked around World War II. And also, state races started showing women voting more for Democrats than they were for Republicans. So the prospect of a Democrat putting a woman on the ticket was still a challenge. And the question was electability. But the candidates and the parties decided they would take a chance. So when Reagan's popularity was not going very well in the early 1983, the electoral calculus went something like this. A woman might help clinch a Democratic victory in a close race. And then once Reagan started doing better, the argument evolved, and they said, well, perhaps rupturing the glass ceiling could generate enough enthusiasm to shake up the race in the Democrats' favor. So as you can see, you have to look at the vice presidency campaign for Geraldine Ferraro within this social context. Without it, we really are not understanding what's going on. But what I want to do is shift for a moment and not just talk about why Geraldine Ferraro and why a woman, but talk about some of the experiences that she had. She faced great sexism. Now, this one I find to be, it's not humorous, but it is humorous. In Mississippi, she was asked whether she could bake a blueberry muffin. Now, how is that important to the vice presidency, I asked myself. In one Meet the Press interview moderated by Malvin Cowell, she was asked, could you push the nuclear button? And whether Mondale would have chosen her if not for her gender. Now, you can imagine Ferraro was not thrilled with those questions. Mm-hmm. And she said, I don't know if I were not a woman, if I would be judged in the same way on my candidacy, whether or not I'd be asked these questions. In other words, what she was saying, if I was a man, would I be asked these same kind of questions? Mm-hmm. And she basically said, that I'm strong enough to push the button, and then moved on.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. And decades later, she labeled the media's treatment of her and her family as sexist. But in 1984, she couldn't say stop it, mm-hmm. because she would look like she was whining, she was upset, she was complaining. So, and other things that happened to her was that she wasn't given the chance to weigh in on their campaign schedule in the early strategy meetings. And when she got sort of fed up with all this, one of the things she said to Mondale's staffers was, imagine me as a gray-haired Southern gentleman and then treat me accordingly. I thought that was brilliant.
That's a good answer.
And so one of the things that Ferraro's candidacy showed the public that a woman could campaign stride for stride for national office. And again, it would not be until 24 years later when Senator John McCain chose Alaska Governor Sarah Palin as his running mate. Mm. So I just thought she had a very, very interesting story.
That leads us to the last past candidate I just want to mention, of course, is Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who ran first as a senator in 2008 against then Senator Barack Obama, and we know how that election turned out. And then she again ran, this time now having been Obama's Secretary of State and securing the nomination to the convention that time in 2016. Do you want to talk a little bit about Clinton's candidacies and how she has led us to this point?
I remember the evening when she lost the run for the White House. I remember my son was working on Capitol Hill. I was just getting all kinds of phone calls because people were in shock. People did not expect Hillary Clinton to lose. And so one of the things that we know is that Hillary Rodham Clinton became the first woman to be a major party's presidential nominee at the Democratic National Convention. And despite winning the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, she lost the Electoral College and conceded the general election on November 9th. And there have been several inquiries into why did Hillary not win? I don't want to say lose, I want to say not win. And, there's been a lot of political observers and scholars that have pointed out many things. And I'll just sort of give you the laundry list. The underlying volatility of the race, Clinton's failure to campaign in Wisconsin, African Americans who didn't turn out as strongly as they did for Obama, although she was expecting that they would be. And then Trump's strong performance among working class white voters in the Rust Belt. And some may agree and some might disagree that Trump became a little bit more steady at the last few weeks of the elections. But others point to the final 12 days of the election that turned the race, that should have gone to her. And this included FBI Director James Comey's intervention in Russia and WikiLeaks. But then there were others, missteps and failures, according to political strategists and commentaries. And some of them noted that simply running the conventional campaign playbook against Trump was considered not a good strategy. And the assumption was based on the thought that what didn't work against Trump in a Republican primary wouldn't suddenly work in a general election. And to conclude anything other than that Trump was a totally unique candidate who required a totally unique approach to beat was a misguided assumption. So again, Trump was not the typical candidate, and Hillary shouldn't have treated him as such. And the other thing was that Hillary Clinton ignored the message that voters were sending in both the Republican and Democratic primaries, which was that they wanted change and that the old ways of doing business wouldn't cut it. Others note the sexism that played a role. And again, we'll talk about sexism and other forms of gender discrimination and bias further on. But this is a few things I wanted to mention just briefly. In the 2016 campaign for president, people were still talking about Clinton's clothes and her makeup and whether she was just an appendage of Bill Clinton and whether she had earned the job, despite the fact that she was very well qualified. Others were noted the coverage of Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky and her reactions to that. And again, someone said she was too stiff, she wasn't authentic, she wasn't real, and she didn't have any emotion, and that she was not likable enough. So as you can see, there is multiple conjectures as to why Hillary Clinton did not win. And what I suggest is that there were, again, not just one reason or two reasons, there were multiple reasons, again, for the upsetting failure of her campaign.
And, I think about, again, what you mentioned, Geraldine Ferraro's, if I was an older white man, would you be judging me on all of these different factors? And those factors you just listed, what are the factors for American women running in the United States that makes it difficult for them to win elections, but in particular, getting through this presidential election that so many have come close but not been able to finish?
So first of all, men are two-thirds more likely to be encouraged to run for office just in general. Women have to be asked 7 times before they seriously consider, and most think that even once they do that, they're still concerned they're not qualified enough. So again, women have to be asked 7 times, whereas men do not have to be asked 7 times at all. There's also a concept called pragmatic bias. And this is a phenomenon in which voters who may prefer a female candidate still fail to vote for her because they believe it will be too difficult for her to win and that others will not support her. So again, this pragmatic bias concept was born out of a Pew Research surveys, which found that 80% of voters at least partly believe that other Americans aren't ready to elect a woman in higher office. And also, most citizens in this country believe that more than half of Americans, I would say more than half Americans point to women having to do more to prove themselves as a major obstacle for women seeking high office. But before I get into further reasons why it's more difficult for women to run for office, I want us to think about why is it important anyway? And one of the things we know, and this, again, we do a lot of this work at the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policies, is that studies have shown that increasing the representation of women in politics is a huge factor in improving outcomes for women and girls and making sure there's policy and legislation and services that do support issues that squarely relate to women and girls, but also impact communities and families as well. And this is not something that is just found in the United States. It's also found across the globe. Laws against sexual violence, laws promoting gender equality in the workplace. There's so many. But let me go on to talk a little bit more about some of the reasons why it's more difficult for women to run for office than men and be successful. But as I do that, I might interject my thoughts about Kamala. So first of all, we know there's the incumbency factor. Traditionally, men have dominated the political arena. Incumbents make it harder for new voices to be heard. But if we think about Kamala, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Kamala has the advantage of running the coattails of Joe Biden. She has his backers, and she also has new backers. But also his incumbency is something that she's also going to have to run against in the sense of, what he's done in the past and what the administration has done in the past. And clearly she's part of the administration. She has to run on that particular reference. We also know there's issues around how women are treated in the media. And I'm just going to give you a couple of ways in which Kamala Harris has been treated in the media or names that she's been called in the media, highlighting her opponent's thoughts. And these are from both her earlier run for presidential office and her current run. Mm-hmm. They have called her a childless catwoman, as you know, heard of, no stake in the future, a DEI hire, dumb, stupid, not authentic, can't win. We have focused on her physical appearance and her tone and even her laugh. She's been called weak and indecisive. People have questioned whether she's a true American. And oh, by the way, she slept her way to the top. And also, as we're thinking about how the media has treated her, that relates to stereotypes. And some of the things, and these are stereotypes that relate to women and people of color. Lying bitch, and I'm sorry for these terms, unlikable, angry. She has been connected to what we call Joe and the hoe, a steamroller, mean, aggressive, disrespectful, and again, dumb. So I have to pause as I'm saying that because it's very upsetting in so many ways. And what we know is that Harris's identity as a multiracial woman invariably means voters' attitudes about gender, race, and the intersection will come into play in this election.
Listening to what you just spoke about and listed, it really sounds as if history has not really evolved since even the first candidates. I mean, in some cases, maybe it's become even more out in the open, the sexism. But how do you feel knowing that that's how Kamala has been perceived and the fact that it doesn't seem to have changed from 20, 40, 60, 80 years ago?
It's really interesting because I think on one hand, things have not changed much in terms of what you just said. Women are still dealing with both racist and sexist and comments. They have also had to deal with issues relating to, where they're born as well. But at the same time, women have made strides in the political process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what we know, if we begin to look at the trends in the number of women who are running for office, we start looking at the 2020 election, we'll see that there were far more women that were running in the primaries. We also see that there's a lot more support for women running for office in the sense that there's coalitions, there's caucuses, there's training programs. There are women in all kinds of communities that are being educated about the benefits of women running, and that there are also men who are very open and supportive of women candidates as well. So on the one hand, yes, you're correct. Things are still, very murky and very, very difficult when women are running for office, particularly women of color. And one of the things that I found that was really very disturbing when I began to, delve more into the Harris candidacy was that they're using racist and sexual tropes, sexist tropes. I mean, one of the things that J.D. Vance noted was, what the hell have you done? This is one of the questions he asked. What the hell have you done other than collect a government check for the last 20 years? He asked that at a rally. And this evokes the welfare queen trope, which dates back to the 1970s and demonizes single women, especially single Black women who receive government assistance. So you can see how far he was going with this. And to also, when you say childless cat ladies, you are demonizing women who do not have their own children by birth. And again, that's very sexist to sort of say that women have to be viewed in one dimension, in one way. Otherwise, there's something wrong with them. But I think one of the things I think is really important to raise is that research shows that racial resentment among white Americans towards Black Americans has remained stable since the 1980s, but these attitudes are now more closely correlated with political beliefs and partisanship. And I think that's really important to raise if we think about the distinctions between now and before. We're talking about the media and we're talking about public opinion. I want to make sure that we talk about the fact that we now are dealing with online extremism. So this is not only just in newspapers and in the regular media. We're also dealing with extremism online. And I think that's really very important. And the reason that I mention that is that one of the things is that we know that the Center for Democracy and Technology analyzed more than 100,000 posts about congressional candidates in 2020 and found that women of color were twice as likely as white candidates to be singled out by misinformation and disinformation online, and also 4 times as likely to experience violent threats online. I just thought that it was really important because we are in the age of the internet.
You mentioned that. You mentioned that the internet has become a hostile place, particularly for women or people of color or people of, say, different sexualities, etc. And Donald Trump, unlike maybe other past candidates, has been a candidate not afraid to sort of stir those communities. In fact, Trump himself has a history of making overtly sexist remarks in his campaign rallies, on Twitter, on Truth Social, wherever he's, sort of putting out his viewpoints. How do you think having former President Trump in this race, makes it unique, particularly when you're talking about, so the vitriol and stuff that's being stirred up online and elsewhere?
It's really interesting. Again, I was thinking about that question, and I looked at it in 2 ways. I don't think the uniqueness is really about Trump being the running mate to Kamala. And the reason I say that is, yes, he's more extreme, but the women in the past have always had sexist and racist remarks made toward them. And there have been examples of non-traditional candidates in the past, again, him being more so. What I really think is, I want to sort of flip the question on its head. Trump is dealing with a unique person that he's running against. He's never run against a woman of color in his life. And I think that for him, this is probably the most threatening race he has had. I think when he was running against Hillary Clinton, that was challenging and that was difficult. But what I'm seeing with Kamala Harris is that she's not taking his bait. And what I mean by that is that, when he goes down the road of, calling her this or calling her that or insulting her or whatever it might be, she's not really responding to that. She's not responding to that. And the other thing that she is doing is she is not placing her race and her gender at the center of her campaign. And that might sound a little bit ironic, seeing that she is a woman and a woman of color. However, it makes sense because I think what she's doing is something that is uniquely different from Hillary. What Hillary did was that she ran on, clearly policy stances, policy problems, but she also centered her gender in many ways. And she was very proud of that. And she made sure that she responded to Trump when he said something. And what Kamala is basically saying is, I am going to focus on the issues of women and people of color and the middle class. And I am going to actually talk about those issues. So to me, it's more important to talk about the issues that are impacting on the middle class, talk about the issues that are connecting to women and people of color. She did that extraordinarily well at the Democratic convention. She clearly did it in the debate. So what she's doing is she's showing how the issues of abortion, immigration, whatever the issues are, how they impact on women, families in the community. And by doing that, I think is really where the rubber meets the road. And I think that Trump really has to sort of figure out, how do I negotiate and navigate this particular political candidate, because he's never had a candidate like her before. She's also unique by virtue of the fact, she is unique in the virtue of the fact that she's from a Western state. I don't think we've ever had a presidential candidate from the Western states. Again, she's a woman, she's a person of color, she comes from immigrant parentage. She went to a historically Black college, and she identifies as a Black woman, but again was raised primarily by a South Asian woman. So there are many, many things that are different about her than the candidates we've had in the past.
And speaking of differences, Hillary Clinton in her campaign played extremely heavily on being this transformational woman candidate. Campaign materials really played on, her gender. With Kamala Harris, she's taking a different approach. We're not seeing, the campaign specifically highlight her gender. They're sort of letting people on their own run with that. It's fairly obvious. So the campaign seems to have taken the tack to not amplify that. What do you think about that strategy compared to the way Hillary ran her campaign in 2016?
I actually like that strategy. I like that strategy for many reasons. Again, she focuses on issues that matter most to women and makes sure that these stories are highlighted. And when she's highlighting these stories, she provides the full truth about the issues. And again, what I like about her is that when she talks about issues, she makes them not only about women, but about families and communities. You remember in the Democratic convention, she highlighted examples, unfortunately, of women bleeding out in the ER. And she talked about how this didn't just affect the woman, but again, the entire family. And I think the other thing that I really liked about her was that there was a CNN interview, and anchor Donna Bass asked Harris about the viral photo of her grandniece watching her accept the Democratic nomination last month. And the little girl had her hair in braids, and she was in the foreground of the photo. And, so Donna Bass asked her what this means to her. And interestingly enough, the vice president sidestepped the question and said, listen, I am running because I believe that I am the best person to do this job at this moment for all Americans, regardless of race and gender. She, went on to say that it's possible that a man could do the job just as well as she could. And that's something Hillary Clinton never would have done and never would have said. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is the fact that, that was Hillary's approach 8 years ago. But now we have seen a number of women who have been running for high office, running for the presidency. And we have seen that, this does not necessarily always have to be a thing, and that the more you're focusing on the gender, the less you're able to talk about the issues. And what I love about Kamala, again, is that she's not focusing on her gender or her race, but she's clearly talking about issues that relate to race and gender. So I think that I really like that strategy. And she's not doing it in such a way that she's denying who she is. She's not doing that, because she talked about it at the convention and other places. She's talked about her background. She's talked about her family. She's talked about her upbringing. So again, she's not denying who she is, but she's not emphasizing that, but she's still talking about the issues that relate to race and gender and other really important factors, such as immigration. So I think she's pulled it all together in a very, ingenious way.
And, going back to issues, there is one issue for women in particular that has dominated sort of the discussion, the elections of the last, 2 years since the Supreme Court wiped away the precedent of Roe v. Wade. We've seen abortion be a major issue for many campaigns. How do you think this decision by the Supreme Court is influencing Harris's run this year?
I think it's a huge, huge piece of the campaign. And as I noted in the New York Times article a month or so ago, we now know who Trump is. There's no doubt about it. We no longer have to figure out what he is going to do, as he has already done it. So we know that this issue has fired up people, but especially women. And now it's also important that we understand what he's going to be doing around the national abortion ban. As you can see, he skirted that issue as much as he could in the debates.
Also, we kind of saw President Biden sort of have this inability to really talk about abortion in the way that Harris can. Maybe it's partly because of his Catholic identity or for other reasons. But the way you see Harris talk about abortion at the debate, how do you think that changes the race compared to when Biden was in the race prior?
Well, I think it's two things. She's a woman and she's talking about an issue. And I don't want to call abortion a women's issue because I think it's an issue for everyone, but clearly it does impact women disproportionately in many ways. And so she is a woman. So just her being authentic as a woman talking about the issue of abortion. And she clearly is showing in her delivery her passion and her concern for it. But it goes further than that. She's also been asked from the Biden administration throughout her time as a vice president to really handle issues around reproductive freedom and reproductive rights. So she's very educated about this. She knows it. She's been working on the issue for quite a long time. And again, she has made abortion rights a focal point of her campaign but she's also done this, which I think is important. She's worked to connect abortion restrictions enacted in more than 20 states to the Republican nominee. She calls it the Trump abortion bans. The other thing that I think she's doing is she's also connecting the dots. She's not saying this is just about abortion. She's saying this is about contraception. This is about IVF. So at the end of the day, it's not as simple as we say it. And again, the other thing that she does, she highlights, doctors being afraid of being arrested and prosecuted, rape survivors, carrying their babies to term, incest survivors carrying a baby to term, families being denied IVF treatment. But I also want to say, and I think this is really important, again, we have to look at the social context of this issue relating to abortion and the election and Kamala Harris. We also know not too long ago, the Me Too movement exposed sexual harassment and toppled powerful men. And in addition to that, we also know that there are so many more college-educated women and there's also more Democratic women in this country right now. So there is a social context where we've had the Me Too movement. We've had, again, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. We also know the impact of abortion restrictions and what that has meant in many of these states that have Trump abortion bans. And the other thing I think is really important is that she says that, when she is in office, she will do everything that she can and she will sign abortion to be a national right for women again.
And just as we're wrapping up here, I want to look towards what happens if Kamala Harris wins. And I want to talk about it in two different ways. One is a rather negative way, and the other is a positive. So I'm going to start with the negative so that we can end with the positive. But if Kamala Harris wins the election in November, we know we've talked about the underlying currents of sexism, the open hostility there has been to her candidacy. We saw what happened when Joe Biden won the election in 2020 and that there was a long standoff that ultimately ended up with January 6th from President Trump and his supporters. If Kamala Harris is the winner of a close election in November, as it's expected to be close, we don't know who's going to win, but if Kamala Harris wins in a close election in November, are you concerned that her gender and her race on top of each other could fuel even more vitriol than what we saw in 2020 during that sort of period, that transition of power?
Yes, the answer is a hard yes. And I really believe strongly, unfortunately, that we will have a negative reaction that will repeat itself again, but even with more fervor and with a more ugly backlash, with hate crimes not only just around people of color and immigrants, but also an escalating of crimes against women. And I think there's going to be more restrictive laws for all of these groups, including immigrants, and also another possibility of a protest all over the country and insurrections. And one of the things that I did as I was sort of thinking about that question, and interestingly, I jotted some of these things down, and maybe I can't find what I jotted down because it was so heinous. One of the things that we know is that after the Obama election, and he won in 2008, hate crimes went through the roof. And I really wanted to give you some of what I call some of the very, very visceral things that were happening. Churches were burned down, people were beat in the street. There was all kinds of, violence, people being beat up and assaulted with paint and blood saying Obama on the bodies. I mean, there were just things that you can't possibly believe, just really, really, really ugly, ugly situations. So I do believe that we're going to see that again, and we're going to probably see it more. And I think what I understand is that there's a lot of anxiety in this country. There's a lot of anxiety in this country that people of color and women are taking over, and that America is not the same as America has been in the past. There are people who are of lower income who believe that they're being passed by. So there's so many ways in which the anxiety will only be heightened by seeing a woman of color as a president. It will be probably some people's worst nightmare, to say the least. And that's what really, really gives me pause. That's what really, really scares me in so many ways. And the question I ask is, is there anything that can be done to prevent this from happening? Because I'm afraid it's going to be extraordinarily, extraordinarily unpleasant, to say the least.
So given that, the uncertainty over the anger and reactionary stuff that we may see, similar to what happened with President Obama's election in 2008, we also know that there will be this reaction from people who maybe for the first time will feel that by having a president that looks like them, talks like them, that they will feel more representation. And so sort of to end this conversation, we like to talk sometimes about generational change presidents. President Kennedy sort of was one of them, one of the youngest elected at the time and the first Catholic president. President Obama, certainly another as the first black man elected, and another young candidate, by the way. And now we sort of have Vice President Kamala Harris, who, again, sort of the torch being passed from a very elder statesman in President Biden now to the younger, different candidate in Kamala Harris. How do you think the reaction will go not from the negative, but from the positive of if she's able to finally cross that barrier, cross that finish line that so many other women had not been able to pass?
I think there's a lot of positives. First of all, there will be many women who will be quite ecstatic across the board that we have the first woman in the White House. I mean, you can't get any more monumental than that. Outside of we had our first African American president with President Obama. You're also there's going to be people who are going to be very excited that a South Asian woman, again, who is a woman of color, is also represented. Also, she graduated from HBCU, and you don't really know how excited and how much pride people have in HBCUs. In addition to that, I think it's important to note that she is a younger candidate. And the reason that I mention that is she's not just a younger candidate by age, but she's a younger candidate in terms of how she understands and thinks about the world. And one of the things that she has done really well, and I didn't have time to talk about this today, is that she has really galvanized young people. I think then when Biden was running, it was sort of a yawn, should we get involved? And as you can tell, she has really, really upped the ante around electoral politics, people getting excited, whether they be young people, whether they be people of color, whether they be people who are working class who felt as though nobody was really paying attention to them. So I think one of the things she's done is that she's energized the party. She's energized the office of the presidency and what it can mean. In addition to that, she has also found a way to think about how do we come together, which I think is very important. And I know that's something that Obama did. But one of the things that she's been really successful at is really coalition building. She's been able to develop and build coalitions, but also help people within certain groups work together. We now know that we have, the white dudes for Kamala, we have Black women, we have South Asian women, we have young people. So she is really making a difference, not only just in terms of who she represents from an identity perspective, but what she's going to bring to the office. I think that's really very important as well. I'm very, very excited about her candidacy. But one thing I think we should all be very clear of is that this is still a very, very close race. And nobody should be resting on their laurels in terms of no matter who their candidate is, because there's two people running and it's very close. And again, nobody should take anything for granted on either side.
It's not that 14 to 15 vote blowout that Geraldine Ferraro was picked for. It is a close race.
No, not in any way at all. One thing that I think is really important, and I think the reason I didn't talk about it was the fact that, when we talk about women running for office, and we talk about the things I mentioned, the tone, the voice, the dress, the electability, the likability, all those things that are really key components to elections. What we really don't know is that we have no playbook. We have no playbook for Kamala Harris, because most of the research, or all of the research that's been done around women in politics, has really been done in reference to white women. White women have been sort of the category of interest. And so what is really important, if we feel like, women should be nice, but women can't be too nice, because if women are too nice, then they get to be weak. But if they're not nice enough, then they're not like women. So there's all of this sort of back and forth. But there's also ways in which people think about African American women. And so if we think about African American women and who they are and what they should be, then maybe all the rules are out the window. And so we really are in a place where we're going to have a lot of surprises, and we really don't know what we're dealing with in many ways, because Kamala is unique in so many ways.
Thank you, Professor Nsiah-Jefferson, for speaking with me today. It's really been an interesting and a fascinating tour through history to understand how we got here.
Well, it was fun. Thank you so much. I'd do it again. Bye-bye.
There is one woman who did not end up running for any political office, but historians say if she had been born a generation or two later, she could have been a candidate and possibly the first woman president of the United States. And that woman is John F. Kennedy's younger sister and fifth child of Rose and Joe Kennedy, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Born in 1921, less than a year after the 19th Amendment was ratified, Eunice wasn't seen as a potential political figure in the same way her father did his four sons. We hear this in a clip from a JFK Library forum with historian Larry Nsiah interviewing Eileen McNamara about her new biography on Eunice.
You say if that girl had been born with balls, she would have been a hell of a politician, Joe Kennedy is reputed to have said of Eunice, an observation that reflected less on her talents than on the limits of his imagination. The self-made millionaire could envision either of his older sons, the first Catholic president, but couldn't picture his daughter in public office.
Because she was smart as hell. I mean, look at them all. She went to Stanford. She was smart, she was savvy, she was ambitious. It wasn't polite to be ambitious as a woman in the 50s or the 40s, but she was ambitious. She wanted what her father was laying out for her brothers. She knew she couldn't get it the way they were getting it. So she just wormed her way behind the scenes. And she got what she wanted. And what do we have now? We have an Institute of Child Health and Human Development that is called the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Institute for Child Health and Human Development. She created that. The research that has happened there has been extraordinary. The Kennedys' son, Patrick, died of hyaline membrane disease, of a deficiency in lung development. No one dies of that today. Because of the work that went on at the institute that does not exist except for Eunice Kennedy Shriver.
In the last 100 years, it has truly taken a village of bold women to make their mark and help clear a path for the next generation of women in politics. We're joined by NPR political reporter Asma Khalid, who has been following the Harris campaign to discuss how Vice President Kamala Harris represents all those women who came before her, and how this election could be the capstone of all those foundations laid down by the bold and trailblazing women in American history. Asma, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
We wanted to get right into this interview today, which is there's such a long history of women who have run for the White House. The women candidate to first run for the White House was actually Victoria Clayton Woodhull in 1872, almost 50 years before women got the right to vote, courtesy of the 19th Amendment. Now, more recently, we've seen candidates like Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Klobuchar, and most recently, Ambassador Nikki Haley all run for the White House. For you in covering these elections, what has it been like seeing these candidates run, and why do you think it's been so difficult for a woman to make it all the way to the Oval Office?
Well, a couple reasons there. One I will say is that the United States has never actually seen a woman as president. And one thing I'll hear, particularly from Democratic operatives, Democratic voters even, is that it is difficult to imagine something for which there's been no historical precedent. And the reason I say this is that, if you take, for example, Kamala Harris now being the woman at the top of the Democratic ticket, she is a Black woman. And that, I think, presents a particular hurdle in some people's imagination because there's never even been a Black woman as governor of any state in the country. Many folks have never seen Black women in leadership. That, of course, is not, to be abundantly clear, a testament to her ability or inability to do the job. It is just the fact that there's not been a historical precedent for people to see women in this position. So that, I think, is one. The other fact, and we can talk a little bit more about this later, is that women face a particular hurdle as presenting strength. The particular role of a United States president is twofold. You're, of course, the political leader, right, the head of the executive branch, but you are also commander in chief. And to me, that has posed a particular hurdle for some women running for higher office over the years. And you saw Harris specifically try to refer to that and try to squash that in the convention speech that she delivered there in Chicago. There is a line that she referred to where she said, as commander in chief, I will have the most lethal fighting force. I will ensure that the United States has the most lethal fighting force. To me, that language was an attempt to quiet any potential criticism on that role and her ability to be commander in chief.
And I also remember her interview with Oprah where she talked about owning a gun, and if anyone would come into her house, that she would shoot them. That was another, I think, moment like that to project some strength.
That's right. And that also speaks to the fact that I think broadly Democrats have faced criticism from some Republican voters over concerns that they would, quote, take away their guns, right? And so I think both Walz and Harris have been trying to suggest that they understand concerns that voters have around the Second Amendment, but they also believe that there needs to be some gun control measures.
And talking about how women have to project themselves and talk about themselves, we've seen sort of women face some maybe unfair criticism because of their gender. For example, when Geraldine Ferraro ran for vice president, a public official in Mississippi asked her if she could bake a blueberry muffin. Hillary Clinton, there was lots of commentary about her appearance, her hair, her dress, how she carried herself in ways that some critics say other male opponents wouldn't face that type of scrutiny. And in 2020, there was the notion of electability, right, where Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar seem to face that question of electability in a way that maybe candidates like Joe Biden didn't face. What are your thoughts on these type of criticisms for female candidates? And do you think you're seeing similar things in your coverage of Kamala Harris's campaign?
I don't think we are publicly seeing as much similar criticism around gender for Kamala Harris as we have seen in some previous election cycles. And there are a few reasons for that. One I would argue is the conversation the country has shifted. Secondly, she has been the sitting vice president for a number of years, so people are somewhat accustomed to seeing her in that leadership role. But I also think it's because of how she herself is running, down to the clothing choices that she makes, to how she presents herself and leans into her own identity. I think these are all factors into the explaining why we are not seeing some of the same criticism directed towards her as we saw towards previous candidates. It's also worth keeping in mind that Harris has not been shy about pushing back against some of the criticism from Republican voters about her not being a, quote, traditional mother. There was some pretty poignant criticism from Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She, was, of course, was the former Trump press secretary, who criticized Harris for not having her own biological children. Harris has really leaned into the fact that there are many families like hers. Harris is a stepmother, and she was on this popular podcast recently called Call Her Daddy, and she really leaned into the fact that this is not the 1950s anymore, that not all women are aspiring to be humble. I think that this is where the conversation in the country has shifted from, say, 2008, when we first saw Hillary Clinton trying to be the Democratic nominee.
And related to that, while Harris may not be making a big deal of her gender, other outside groups like the Lincoln Project are putting emphasis on gender in ads, but often aimed at a male audience that might be more skeptical or cautious about voting for women. Here's a clip from one that's narrated by actor and kind of masculine icon Sam Elliott.
Kamala Harris has more courage, more honor, more guts than this guy ever had. So you decide, are we really going back down that same fucking broken road? Or are we moving forward towards hope, towards freedom, towards change?
We know a strong middle class has always been critical to America's success.
There's promise that lies in change, and the time for change is now. So what the hell are you waiting for? Because if it's the woman thing, it's time to get over that. It's time for hope, for change. It's time to be a man and vote for a woman.
And what do you think of the strategy, and what do you think this type of messaging has a chance of breaking through?
One thing that I've noticed in covering Vice President Harris is that she has, over the last several years as vice president, not leaned in heavily to her identity as a woman, to her identity as being a Black woman, in the ways I think the traditional press corps of DC has expected her to do so. Now, I take issue with the fact that I actually do think she has, at times, really prioritized these things. And the reason I'll say that is if you look at some of the issues that she has prioritized as being VP, she's really leaned into issues around reproductive rights, childcare, maternal health. That all being said, where I think you have seen the greater focus, whether it is on her gender or her race, it's come from outside groups. Right after Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race, and there was that momentary chatter about what would happen next. Would the party, the Democratic Party, coalesce around Kamala Harris? It was a group of Black women who started organizing to ensure that Kamala Harris would indeed be the nominee. Harris did not say anything very specific right in that moment about her being the potentially first Black woman to be president, but I heard that a lot. I heard it very often in the messaging from allies and organizers around her who felt it would be uncalled for the Democratic Party to bypass her. And so to that point, look, I think there's value in allies, organizers around her potentially leaning into this messaging to try to quash criticism of it, because people do have hesitancy. We've never seen someone collectively as a country who is a woman, let alone a Black woman, at the seat of the White House, there in the Oval Office. But Harris, I would argue, has determined it is not beneficial for her to do this. But I also would make the case that I don't know, having covered Harris, how much it is her natural inclination to sit there and sort of delve into questions around identity. You've heard her kind of touch on this a few times, where there's even racial identity. She'll say, reporters will ask her about this, but she's never really had questions, she'll say, about her own identity. She has felt particularly comfortable with where she is. And I think there's a part of that is who she is. There's a part of her also, I would argue, that has seen how other people have ran for the job and not been successful doing the strategies and adopting the certain tactics of leaning into their gender identity.
And then over on the other side, how have you seen the Trump campaign approach Kamala Harris's gender? He often, refers to strength when it comes to dealing with foreign leaders, but more for when he talks about women being a protector. So how is he handling this situation? How are voters reacting to that?
Well, broadly, Trump, right out the bat, when Joe Biden stepped down from the top of the ticket, really struggled for several weeks to adapt to the new environment. And he didn't seem to have a very compelling message or strategy for how to deal with Harris at the top of the ticket on the other side. Some of that, I think, was just inertia. He expected to be running against Joe Biden. Much of his messaging focused on him being elderly and his particular policies during the last few years in office. So I want to say that I think it's been important that I think above gender, above racial identity, above all of that, Trump really struggled for several weeks as to what his specific tactic was with a changed Democratic Party, a changed Democratic ticket. When it comes to issues around gender, as you suggested there, we've heard Donald Trump really lean into this idea of him being a protector of women. He said, I believe last month at a rally in Pennsylvania, that you will be protected to women and I will be your protector. That's sort of the role he sees. In terms of Harris herself, in many moments he has suggested that she is not qualified for the job, that she is dumb. He has gone after her intelligence, and that's something that we saw percolating in right-wing circles ever since really Harris took the job as vice president. She would be criticized for the way that she spoke, for sort of word salad, as they would say. She was criticized for her laugh. And that was definitely a feature of conversation in conservative circles. It's something that I would say has continued on. Whether or not it picks up beyond those circles, I don't know. I just think by and large, this is an incredibly competitive, close presidential election. And a lot of people have baked in opinions about Donald Trump, whether they approve of him or disapprove of him. And so really, this election is going to come down to tight, small margins in a couple of key states.
And for our final issue that we want to touch on for this race and gender, obviously abortion is playing a huge role this year, but this will be the first time in 40 years there's no protected right to choose in the United States. Do you think this changes the equation on Kamala Harris's campaign running as a woman compared to previous female candidates?
It certainly could. And the reason I say that is that ever since the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade with that Dobbs decision in December of 2022, in every ballot initiative, in any place where it has been placed, any conservative or more liberal leaning state, it doesn't matter. Voters have chosen to expand abortion access, abortion rights. Now, whether or not that translates to Harris, I don't know. But the one indication we have is that there were expectations that Democrats would do worse than they did in the 2022 midterms. The post-game analysis suggests that abortion was a greater factor in energizing Democratic voters to come out and support Democrats that cycle than many pundits and political experts had expected. Many voters told us that the economy was really top of mind, high prices, inflation, but it turned out abortion was a bigger factor. You listen to Vice President Harris, and key argument of her presidential campaign is that this election is about freedom. She talks about freedom being a part of reproductive rights and women being able to choose what they want to do for their body, whether or not they personally, morally agree with abortion. She argues that it's not the government's decision to be involved here. This is an issue she has felt comfortable in engaging in. It is an issue that she has really heavily leaned into. When President Biden was at the top of the ticket, he was not out there extensively campaigning and talking about abortion. The administration had by and large chosen Vice President Harris to be the leader on this issue. So I would say it's one of the issues she feels the most comfortable on, is an issue she has led on in the Biden administration. The question I have is whether or not people will directly link voting for a Democrat with access to abortion, right? Because the reason I mentioned that is, take a state like Arizona. We know that abortion access will be a ballot issue there. I was out there many months ago when petitioners were trying to get that issue on the ballot. And I met a couple of different women who identified as Republican who wanted greater access to abortion, but also were intending, if Trump was on the ballot, to vote for him for re-election. Harris makes the argument, and I'll hear her say this on the stump out on the campaign trail, that the overturning of Roe versus Wade, she makes the argument, was directly attributable to Donald Trump appointing 3 conservative Supreme Court justices. Now, whether or not voters make that connection, I don't know. I'm not sure that there's a linear connection all voters will make. We'll have to see how that pans out. But Democrats certainly feel optimistic, and the Harris campaign feels good when the conversation is about abortion rather than, say, the economy, immigration, a potential regional war in the Middle East. Those issues are not what plays to Democrats' advantage. It's much more the conversation around abortion.
And the last question kind of goes to that other side. J.D. Vance at the only vice presidential debate admitted that Republicans, from his perspective, need to do a better job getting women to trust them. How is that strategy going on the other side?
Look, there has been a gender gap in presidential politics for years. I think you have to go back to, say, the 1980s. It is very common that women tend to vote more for the Democratic Party and men tend to vote more for the Republican Party. What I think is really key in this moment in time is that the gender gap appears to be growing wider. We could be looking at election results after November that show us potentially the largest gender gap I would say in any recent history that we've seen, right? In 2022, and please do fact check me on this, but I believe it was 12 points, the gender gap. I mean, if you're talking about a bigger gender gap than that, it is just a part of current American politics and the polarization that you see in American politics. I would say at this moment in time, you're seeing both campaigns lean more heavily into that gender gap dynamic. So, right, you did hear, to your point, J.D. Vance sort of try to make an appeal on the debate stage to some more moderate, let's say, suburban women. But at the same time, you have seen Trump heavily lean into and court what I would describe as male influencers, right? Going on the podcast in the manosphere. He talks about boxing. He's talked to Tucker Carlson. And on the flip side of that, you've seen Harris sit down with Oprah. You're going to see her on The View this week. She just sat down with a Call Her Daddy podcast. She is also really leaning into boosting her support amongst women, young women. And it almost feels like there's this realization that this is the electoral dynamic that both parties have. And so, sure, maybe on the margins, they'll try to reach out and try to court, folks from the other side. But there's a lot of base politics going on here in terms of just energizing support. And so that's where you're seeing Trump really lean into that base of support. And I would say you're seeing Harris really lean into her base of support with women.
Well, Asma, thank you for giving us your thoughts from the field. Wish you the best in covering the rest of this election.
Thank you very much. It was great to speak with you.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you for listening to our last episode in our special season looking at the historic nature of the 2024 election. If you're interested in learning more about some of the topics we've discussed today, you can visit our podcast page at jfklibrary.org/JFK35 for this episode.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or find us across social media at JFK Library FDN using the hashtag JFK35. If you like what you heard today, please consider subscribing or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.